My name is Robert Dabney, and I am a consultant with the Caribbean Policy Development Center. For the past 18 months, we have had a group of organizations from across the region that have been working with the CPDC on making the rights of domestic workers and artisans accessible through the free movement of skilled workers regime. Our first speaker this morning is Shantal Munro Knight, the Executive Director of the Caribbean Policy Development Center.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning to everyone, colleagues, members of the media. The Caribbean Policy Development Center, it's a regional non-governmental organization based in Barbados, but working throughout the Caribbean. Our kind of main ethos and mandate is about ensuring that people in the Caribbean, and when we talk about people, ordinary citizens within the Caribbean can understand their role and their rights within the policy-making process. And therefore, it is in this context that we sought to engage artisans and domestics to help them to understand fundamentally their role and their rights as accorded to them under the single market and economy, specifically the freedom of movement regime. I want to begin, though, by first acknowledging the support that we would have received from the Caribbean Aid for Regional Integration and Trade Fund, the CART Fund of the Department of the International Development, DFID, and administered by the Caribbean Development Bank, so that the project is actually being funded through the CART Fund and administered through the CDB. The project targets 5 key countries. We are working, as Robert would have indicated, in Trinidad and Tobago, St. Kitts and Nevis, Guyana, Barbados, and Jamaica. And essentially, we're working with these implementing partners to undertake a series of processes which at the end of the day are really designed to ensure that the free movement regime actually works for the people that is intended to reach. When we looked at the regime and when we looked at the categories that were allowed to move under the regime, we realized that these groups, artisans and domestics, although they had been given the right, there were specific impediments to them being able to actually move. And the project, therefore, is designed to, first of all, as I indicated, help them to understand their right to move, and to help them to take advantage of that process, but also to speak to the policymakers directly about what it is that they need to ensure that the regime moves and facilitates their movement, which is very, very, very critical. And it's very interesting that we are meeting just today after International Women's Day, notwithstanding the fact that we do have artisans who are part of the group. A very important ethos of this project is the recognition that women do represent a vulnerable group within the society, and that is important in the context of movement throughout the region, that we are ensuring that there are things that are in place in order to give them the protection that they need. An important component of the project is the provision of what we are calling support services, which we think is actually a very innovative and kind of novel approach. And what we are saying is that as we seek to facilitate the movement, we want to ensure that as people move, that experience is one that is beneficial, both for the country that they are moving to and then for the individual themselves. We recognize that when people attempt to move, that they may encounter difficulties, whether that is in the context of the immigration, etc. And therefore, the partners that we are working with have committed themselves to ensuring that they can provide the necessary support to domestics and artisans as they move throughout the region. Importantly as well, though, we are at the stage where we do want to be able to indicate to the policymakers what is important in order for the facilitation of that movement to be achieved. And we do so in the context of recognizing that the CARICOM Secretariat and heads have just recently agreed to a new strategic plan. And one of the kinds of key pillars of that strategic plan is about recommitment and ensuring that the single market and economy actually works, and again, works for the people. And so we are saying that if that is going to be a commitment within the context of the strategic plan that will guide CARICOM, I think it is over into 2019, then this and this constituency has to also be extremely important. And one of the key messages that we want to be able to say to our policymakers is that in the context of designing a regime for people who are supposed to be benefiting from it, these people should be very much part of the decision-making process. And we are therefore asking for our CARICOM heads to be able to signal a commitment to ensuring that when there are decisions to be taken for this constituency, that they be allowed to have a seat at the table with them and also within the relevant community organs of CARICOM. Importantly as well, what we're also asking is that we recognize that there have been tremendous movement in the context of the regime. We do appreciate that there are efforts on train that are happening right now to ensure that from the administrative perspective, from the legislative perspective, that the regime is put in place across all of the member territories. At the same time, it is a little bit challenging to ask stakeholders that have been given a right to hold on and wait while you get your house in order. What it says to them is that, you know, you've given me a right, but hold on, I haven't actually got all the things together. For me, I tell people it's like, you know, architects have designed a house, they've looked at it, and they themselves have decided what it is that how they want that house to look. But then when visitors come to the door, they tell them, hold on, you can't have a seat because we don't have any furniture in the house. And we think that it's important that CARICOM recommits itself to ensuring that the regime is implemented urgently and consistently across all member states. What we have found is that we have, for our stakeholders, are encountering different levels of implementation and different challenges across countries, and that we feel that this could be mitigated if the regime is implemented consistently in all of the member countries. I'll stop there because importantly we want to ensure that the stakeholders themselves get to speak on their own behalf. But I will welcome any questions or comments or queries. Thank you.
Good morning. All of our organizations have been working with the Caribbean Policy Development Center to secure the rights for domestic workers and artisans under the free movement of skilled worker regime. We thank Mrs. Shantal Munro Knight and Ms. Alana Benjamin and the Caribbean Policy Development Center for this very important project. In Jamaica, before this project, with the Caribbean Policy Development Center, most persons did not know about Artisans. Since the project was launched in Jamaica, in conjunction with the Jamaica Household Workers Union, we have mobilized and educate artisans to come together. And in short order, the Artisans Association will be launched. Ms. Michelle Clark was assigned the leader and Ms. Dawn Bartley her assistant. We participated in 2 health fairs, one at the University of the West Indies and the other at the Emancipation Park, where both groups displayed their wares. President Price arranged an interview for Ms. Dawn Bartley, who is an artisan, on the Jamaica television, on Television Jamaica primetime morning show. Our project launch was very successful. We had personnel from Ministry of Labor and Social Security, Minister of Foreign Affairs, University of the West Indies, National Council on Technical and Vocational Education, and 2 media houses was also there. The media houses are the Jamaica Information Service and the IRA FM. The launch was on the Ministry of Labor's website. Respect for domestic workers in Jamaica has been growing. Last year, the Grace Kennedy Company Limited, one of Jamaica's largest food distributing companies in the island, conceptualized the idea of honoring the late Dr. Heather Little-White, who was once employed to Grace Kennedy for many years. They then came up with the idea of the inaugural Grace Kennedy Heather Little-White Household Worker of the Year award. Employers were encouraged to nominate their household workers by writing an essay with 200 words about their household workers. My employer nominated me, and from a field of 128, I was chosen as the Household Worker of the Year, and Mr. Edward McGowan, the second place runner-up, who is the only male in the Jamaica Household Workers Union. This award has shown recognition and appreciation for the hard work that household workers have been doing over the years. At the awards ceremony, Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller spoke of our own household worker. Also, Mr. Dan Webby, the Chief Executive Officer at Grace Kennedy, spoke of his household worker. Once again, respect has been growing in Jamaica for household workers. On behalf of my colleagues in the other CARICOM member states, I implore the governments to ratify the Convention 189, which is the Domestic Workers Convention, which gives us domestic workers protection. We thank the Guyana government for ratifying the Convention 189. Thank you all.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
On behalf of the other countries in the CARICOM, we would like CARICOM to ensure that the complaints mechanism is simple and transparent for reporting grievances. We also want them to take into consideration the limitations that artisans and domestic workers are facing when they're doing this. Thank you.
Good morning, all. I'm going to give a brief on the collision of service providers. Okay, it plays an important factor in the overall plans and development for freedom of movement of artisans and domestics. And if I get 3 points: to facilitate the development of regional body for key artisan groups, to provide info on the pertinent decision-making processes on the skilled workers regime as an important category, and 2, to consider prioritizing assistance for the establishment of National Association for Key Artisan Groups to assist with awareness and advocacy, as well as providing inputs into on pertinent decision-making processes on the CSME free movement of skilled workers. And 3, to provide assistance to new and or existing domestic workers associations to build their capacity in formalizing the arrangement to assist with awareness and advocacy, as well as providing inputs into on pertinent decision-making processes on the CSE free movement of skilled workers regime as an important category. Well, from St. Kitts and Nevis, we're in a unique situation now because in 2006, the agreement was signed allowing free movement of artisans and domestic. But to date, nothing has been enacted in St. Kitts at all. Attempts were made to have meetings, to be honest, with both ministries, and to little avail, if you ask me. To be honest, we have organized a TVET council there, which is a key factor in getting things forward. But strange that may sound, in the last year, we've had going through a political turmoil, if that's the correct word, and we have had a change of government. So I'm looking forward to meeting with the new Minister of Trade and Industry Commerce and also the Minister of Culture on my return, who will move things forward. I have no doubt that with the change of government, we'll see positive moves. Unfortunately, artisans and domestic regarded even below the lower part of the ladder. We have high-income workers, middle income, low income. It is fair to say that this group of workers are not recognized. I mean, for whatever reason, they're looked down as inferior people. And how important it is to have artisans and domestic, especially in our communities. The freedom of movement of artisans is so important because we have seen it happening. There are lots of CARICOM officials come to St. Kitts and they do this type of work, but for whatever reason, our governments don't recognize the usefulness of these group of people. I must compliment the Caribbean Policy Development Center for taking the initiative. Because as I said earlier, the governments, for some reason, overlooking such an important part of our community. And I would like officially to congratulate the CPDC for taking the initiative and moving forward with such an important perspective of free movement of artisans and domestics. May I say one more thing? It is important that we continue as an organization. We must organize a Caribbean organization of artisans and domestics. That is so important because we see problems with CARICOM working together. Maybe it's a good opportunity for us as groups from all the Caribbean islands to get together and have a joint association, which I think is one positive move in the right direction. I thank you for the brief moment, and I'll be willing to answer any questions at a future date. Thank you very much.
Our concern is really about Convention 189, ILO Convention 189. In that convention, it spells out a clear definition of who is a domestic worker. Because for years, we have been discriminated against because there is no clear definition of who is a domestic worker. In that convention, it also spells out our rights and obligations under the convention. And a right to a 40-hour work week, a right to minimum wage like everybody else, a right to be able to have a collective agreement, which is very important for domestic workers. So we want to ensure that CARICOM work together with domestic workers to ensure that we have a clear definition of who is a worker. Because in Trinidad and Tobago, domestic workers are not only women. We have domestic workers who are gardeners, chauffeurs, handymen, watchmen. They are also considered domestic workers. Domestic workers is really people who come to your homes, they cook, they clean, they take care of your children, the elderly, and the sick. So what we are really doing is taking care of society at large. And we want that work acknowledged, because why we have to struggle and fight for that is we're really fighting against poverty, you know. Poverty and inequality for women throughout the Caribbean. So we want to end that. And in order for us to end that, we must get that ILO Convention 189 implemented throughout the Caribbean. Yes, they have been they have ratified the Convention 189 in Guyana, but we haven't heard what are the benefits that domestic workers are really getting in Guyana. And I think we should all come together to force the government of Guyana to ensure that domestic workers there get decent work. Because we all want decent work. Decent work is important to us because we know that in the Caribbean our greatest challenge is the poverty. And not only that, it is also characterized by economic and social deprivation and the inability to enjoy the decent work. So that is what we in Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension the Caribbean, are really looking forward to. Because mind you, if domestic workers, the definition of domestic work and domestic workers is not clearly defined, we will continue to be discriminated against and remain in poverty. And that is the whole intention of this 189, to take women out of poverty, women and men. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. LeBlanc. One of the couple of other things, and we'll open it up to any questions you may have for any members of the panel. I'd like to ask Don Bartley. Don, would you mind standing for a minute? Don Bartley is also with the Jamaica Household Workers Union. And if you see that table of goods over there, Don is an artisan. And on display on that table are your works, right, Don? Sure. Those are things that you have made. So we have... Shoes for guys, though. So we have with us this morning, and thank you, Don, thank you. Just so that you know that the people that you see before you are not just executives of their associations and their unions, but they are also domestic workers, they are also artisans. And so I'd like to open the floor up now for any questions that you may have for any members of the panel. Panelists, I will ask you if there's a question directed to you, that you come to the podium to the mic. So are there any questions?
Yep. Not sure who it applies to. I know there's a lot of different areas of CARICOM represented here, but Dominica has just signed on to the CCJ. Does that, they're accepting that, does that bring them closer to where you're looking at? Has Dominica been engaged into this current seminar?
Thanks very much for that question. So the simple answer is Dominica hasn't necessarily been engaged as one of the project countries, because right now we're targeting 5 project countries. And we do welcome the fact that Dominica has signed on to the CCJ. I think perhaps what is important is that in the context of the freedom of movement regime, is that regime and, how should I put it, any legal challenge that may arise thereof is applicable to across all member states, regardless of whether or not they have officially signed on to the CCJ. And that's just because then we have to, sorry, Alana's giving me some direction. That is also because if we understand how CARICOM is set up in terms of the original jurisdiction, so that the CCJ is one element, but the community law, which came out of the Shanique Myrie case, indicates then that when there are disputes having to do with the regime itself, it is applicable across all member states. So any issue, any legal conflict that may arise in the context of the freedom of movement regime can go before the CCJ and can be applicable even if member states are not part of the CCJ.
I'm glad you brought up Shanique Myrie, because my next area that I wanted to look at, Shanique Myrie was considered sort of a test case to prove that CARICOM should, how it should work. Is there anything else that will come forward, going forward, that shows that stuff needs to be added or removed, or it's just, the mechanism is just fine based on the fact that the decision was made and enforced?
I think that the process will be an ongoing one. I mean, in the case particularly for our stakeholders here, domestics and artisans, the regime hasn't necessarily been working as yet. So what we are hoping to do is to get it to work. And as it begins to work, then we may see issues and challenges that will arise. And in that context then, the assumption is that the regime then will be open to those challenges and changes that need to be made in order to make the regime work. What the Shanique Myrie case did, it indicates that member states have an obligation to ensure that they have what is necessary in place to afford the CARICOM citizens to be able to to live their rights. And that is the important thing, is that states therefore cannot opt out, like I said before, by indicating that they do not either have the administrative or the legislative provisions in place, but that they have an obligation, because community law is a living law that is applicable within the context of the nation state. And I think that's an overarching protection which is important in there. But I'm sure that as the regime moves forward, particularly, like I said, for our two groups, that we may see different things arising that the regime may have to respond to. And if I wanted to just add a little bit more to something that was said about the complaints mechanism, and just to emphasize how important this is in the context of the regime. Now, the complaints mechanism was established not just for artisans and domestics. It's a complaint mechanism for all of the categories of people who are moving under the regime, who encounter difficulties. The reason why we are calling for it to be simplified is, again, because we recognize the social positioning of our stakeholders. Many of them, if you have a UWI graduate, they might be able to negotiate better with an immigration official. When you have a domestic or an artisan, there is a higher likelihood of them being intimidated at the point of entry, in the face of an immigration officer who may be telling them that they are not necessarily allowed to be able to move. The complaints mechanism has to be simple enough that our stakeholders will be able to understand it and be able to use it. And importantly, very, very importantly, they have to know about it. They have to know about it and understand the procedures and the fact that the complaints mechanism actually gives them redress within the process. And that is why this is a very, very important component for us. And we are saying to the officials, let's get it right. Let's make sure that stakeholders can actually use this mechanism that is designed to, again, help them when they are entering or at the point of entry in their movement.
Who are the biggest members dragging their feet in that regard?
In terms of the complaint mechanism specifically, I can't say in terms of the complaints mechanism specifically. The complaints mechanism, I think, was only finally improved in 2014. So it's in the process of being implemented. So we would now have to assess that a little bit later on. I don't know that it would necessarily be a member state necessarily dragging their feet. It has to do about whether the people who are administering the process have sufficient education and are aware of it, so that it is our member states properly educating their immigration officers about the process, and also, as well, like we said, our end users also fully educated. And we feel that if we can have those two ends meet, then the process can actually work. And we do know that right now that there is ongoing training for immigration officers right across all the CARICOM countries.
No, you're just my last part, because I was going to ask you something that I'd asked in October 2013. Is this a kind of refresher or something? I'm going to say this thing. Something to teach immigration officers to be human beings and not.
I think just to be very fair, one of the things that this project did in the very first part was we had what we call these technical working meetings, and at those meetings we brought together all of the kinds of stakeholders. So it was immigration officers, it was CSME focal points, it was some of our stakeholders to try to meet, to talk out and discuss what are the issues. And we have to be fair to immigration officials. Immigration officials have been tasked to man the border. That is their task, to protect the border. Then you have a regime that comes in and says, let people in. So that there is a need for a change in orientation within that context. But I do want to indicate that we are, like I said before, very aware that there has been a commitment to ongoing training of immigration officials as a key pillar in moving forward the regime. And that's why, Ian, if you have that complaints mechanism, and once the process works so that our stakeholders understand their rights, and immigration immigration officials understand how it is to be administered, then you can perhaps have, kind of less conflict there. Importantly as well, I would say, is that call that we have made for the regime to be implemented consistently across all the member countries is also important. What you have is that states are at different stages of implementation. So an immigration officer has to be true to where his country is at in relation to their level of implementation. So if we can have that consistent level of implementation across, and all immigration officers having the same understanding about how the regime is to be administered, again, I think that would be an important kind of move forward in terms of making sure that the regime works smoothly for everyone.
Thank you for the questions, and thank you. I think it's important to note in that line, again, that when we talk about the uneven implementation of the regime, the fact is that for artisans, the regime was opened up in 2006, for domestic workers in 2009. So in the latest instance, it has been 6 years since these groups have had, at least 6 years, since these groups have had access to the regime, and so far we don't have full and equal implementation across the region. And we have a whole panel of domestics and artisans here. I'm just going to ask, will the other participants in the workshop from the other countries, would you all just stand so that folks can see you? And I want to thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you all very much for participating with us in the meetings. We had a question.
What are some of the major complaints coming from domestics and artisans, particularly those who are moving around the region?
Any one of our artisan and domestic community, I know you all hear those complaints and deal with them directly. Ms. LeBlanc?
Yes, we have a lot of migrant workers coming into Trinidad and Tobago from the Caribbean. And most of the complaints are sometimes when they come in with a certificate, in particular Jamaica, because Jamaica has went as far as CVQ and they have the national qualifications. And some of them have complained to me that when their colleagues came in, they were sent back. So we still believe that the immigration officers are not up to date and up to par with what is going on within the CARICOM and the single market economy. Because it's very unfair for people to leave the country, domestic workers in particular, who work for less than the minimum wage in some countries, save the money, come to Trinidad or anywhere else, and then to be sent back, even though they work with a CVQ, a certificate to ensure that they have the right to enter the country. And it's so important because we have a lot of human trafficking. And we don't want domestic workers to end up victims of human trafficking. So that is why it is so important, to update and have orientation with the immigration officers so that when domestic workers reach borders, they can come in, and they don't have to be treated different from other people.